The CoinWeek Podcast is brought to you by PCGS. Visit PCGS at the Long Beach Expo Coin Currency Stamp and Sports Collectibles Show and submit your coins to receive the very cool Long Beach Expo exclusive label. It looks like a California license plate, and you'll love it. On February 20 to 21st from 10:30 to 12:30, collectors can meet with expert Steve Feltner to talk about coins. PCGS will also show off a spectacular set of Flying Eagle and Indian cents. Plus, you can partake in the next great installment of the Tyrant Collection, created by PCGS and presented by Goldbergs. The Long Beach Expo is held at the Long Beach Convention Center starting on Tuesday, February 20, and wraps up Saturday, February 22. One of the greatest coin shows in America returns, and we hope you can attend. This week in the CoinWeek Podcast, numismatic writer Chris Bulfinch joins us. Chris is a former associate editor at Coin World magazine and currently writes for a number of numismatic publications, including ours. He is also a co-host of the Coin World Podcast, along with Jeff Stark. Chris and I talk about what got him into coins, the responsibilities of the numismatic journalist as the hobby storyteller, and how the availability of information about coins online has changed the hobby, and how that isn't enough to save some people from themselves. It's an engaging, behind-the-scenes look at how we cover the market, and you'll hear all about it next on the CoinWeek Podcast. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining me on the CoinWeek Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
We've known each other for a little while, maybe a year or so. I think the last time I saw you in person, however, was at the EAC last year in Dayton, Ohio. We went to go get lunch together with Jeff Stark from Coin World. And at the time, you were a full-time Coin World staffer. You still work with Coin World, and you're still doing the Coin World podcast. So for the Coin Week audience, who may not be that familiar with your work, please talk a little bit about yourself and how long you've been collecting and how you got into the coin industry.
Sure. You're absolutely right, Charles. We did last see each other at EAC Dayton, which was a fabulous show. I'd actually never been to an EAC convention before, so that was definitely a good experience for me to get a little bit more acquainted with a side of the industry with which I was less familiar. To answer your question, I became a Coin World staffer right at the end of the summer of 2018. Shortly after I graduated from college. I graduated from Trinity College in Hartford in May of 2018, and I had been working as a freelance contributor for a good chunk of my senior year of college after I wrote an opinion column to Bill Gibbs in response to one of his editor's columns, sort of pontificating about and theorizing on the dearth of younger folks in the hobby, and all of 21 or 22 at the time. I felt like I had at least some relevant perspective. So I had written in, and I'd been a Coin World subscriber for the better part of a decade at that point. I had been collecting coins in one form or another since I was a very young kid, inspired, as many collectors are, by collections that I inherited from both of my grandfathers. And that sort of started this lifelong fascination with coins, currency, and the history behind them. And so I'd been subscribed to Coin World since about 2010, 2011. So when the opportunity came to contribute on a freelance basis in college as a sort of young, aspiring writer, I caught at the opportunity. And I was informed that there was an associate editor's position that was opening up. They were looking to hire someone, and I was, on a short list of names, and I was lucky enough to go out, have an interview, and I was hired there. And I worked there for just shy of a year and a half. And as you mentioned, I continue to work on a freelance capacity. Almost every week, I have at least one piece published, and then I usually have a couple in the monthly, and between one and about three in the weeklies. And then, as you also mentioned, I co-host alongside Jeff Stark of the Coin World Podcast, which we are just approaching our 1 year mark. In a few episodes, we'll hit a year of doing it, which has been really enjoyable. And we were grateful that you came on. You came on, I think, I want to say sometime in the episode 20 something or 30 something, and I don't have the list in front of me, but and we were really grateful for that. So that's sort of that's the very long elevator pitch for my my history in the hobby and the industry.
Well, I'm very glad and flattered you guys had me on when you did. I think it'd be interesting for people to get your take on what it's like and what are the first things you learned when you go from being a coin collector hobbyist to becoming somebody whose responsibility is to inform other collectors about what's going on in the market and the hobby. What did you learn right out of the gate when you turned that corner and started to write articles and follow the news? What was the most surprising element of that transition from hobbyist to professional?
The first thing that I learned is that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I knew. I feel like it's easy and I think understandable for a lot of collectors who know so much more than a person in the general population about coins and currency and their history, how coins come to be, what coins have there been in the past, how do they function today. It's and they're hobbyists at all skill levels who rightly feel like they have a lot of knowledge because anyone who is a subscriber to Coin World or who reads CoinWeek has a much more sophisticated base of knowledge than the average person who might not know very much at all about coins. Which again, it's understandable. It's not exactly something you necessarily learn about in school or in any of the other sort of places in life. I think a lot of people, especially in an age where we're moving more and more towards cashless transactions, there's there's not really any reason that sort of person out in the world would necessarily know much at all about coins, and they could absolutely be forgiven for that. But so approaching it, I felt like I had a pretty strong base of knowledge, and in some ways, I suppose I did when I started. But there's an old saying or aphorism or something that the more we learn, the more the depths of our ignorance unfolds, right? So it's you have to get to a certain level of knowledge before you realize just how much there is to know. And I understood that I had a lot to learn and a long way to go towards in the direction of becoming a true numismatist or a true numismatic professional. And so it's daunting at times. It's definitely intimidating. I remember the first show I ever attended as a reporter, I met Ken Bressett. I bumped into him at a talk that he was giving, and I went up to him, and, in the back of my head, I'm like, oh my God, you wrote the Red Book, he's, contributed a lot to the, to numismatic, literature and to the hobby. And so, to meet people, face to face whose names you might be very familiar with, can be intimidating at first. And absolutely, there are going to be moments, there have been moments, and I'm sure a couple of them have been caught on our podcast to be sure, where every once in a while I'll just walk into a situation and not know anything. And of course, every once in a while when you're in that kind of a situation, you can open your mouth and say something foolish, or in my case, write something foolish, which I've definitely made, there are small mistakes as far as research. You misidentify a coin or a designer, or you use the wrong term. And so you have to, at least in my experience, keeping an open mind, understanding that you're going to make mistakes and there are going to be, screw ups. And as long as, you can feel that they were honestly made, and as long as you can be honest with yourself about how much you know, and especially when you don't know something, and, try to seek out either a piece of literature, a piece of writing, or a person, or a piece of media really, or a person who might be able to answer your question as accurately as you can. So, I told a lot of people as I was working at Coin World that one of the things I was grateful for the opportunity to work there, right out of college, at a magazine that I've been reading for years. And more than just being grateful for the opportunity, I was also really grateful to be able to work at a job where every day I knew that I was going to learn something new, or every day I was going to, come across a writer or an article or, a new type of coin or token or note that I'd never encountered before. And that kind of possibility for growth was really exciting.
Well, I would comment that when I came into the industry, the first coin show that I went to, I was taken under the tutelage of David Lasso. And David was producing video content for CoinWeek at the time. and CoinWeek had uploaded quite a few videos that David had made since he and Scott had launched CoinWeek in 2010. And it was obvious to me that David had grown up with pretty much everybody at the convention. And he looked up to certain people, and he knew all of the inside scoops. And I remember him getting kind of giddy to have his photograph taken with Larry Stack, Harvey Stack, and Q. David Bowers. And I remember when this was going on, he told them that, you guys are my idols. I've looked up to you for years. And I remember thinking at the time that although it would be cool to have my picture taken with these guys, that I hadn't yet developed those deep relationships yet with these people, and I would somehow feel like I'd be imposing myself on them to ask to have a photo of them taken with me. It'd be kind of like name dropping, and so I didn't go for that. Even though I had purchased and read many of Q. David Bowers' books at the time, and as a matter of fact, my grandmother, one of the first books she gave me when I came into the hobby was Norman Stack's Guide to Collecting Type Coins. So I had a familiarity with the Stack family and with Q. David Bowers. I just had one as a regular collector from a distance. I didn't have that personal relationship. And believe me, when I was growing up, I had no wealth or illusions of wealth or any idea that I'd be buying coins at any major numismatic auctions or even attending a national coin convention. But I certainly didn't have personal relationships when I started out as a professional. But what I learned quickly was that coin collecting at the professional level really does demand personal relationships, and it is a lifestyle. When you're traveling the country, meeting and talking with people and trying to tell their stories to the wider public, these people sort of become part of your larger family. So that being said, when did you start to appreciate the weight of your responsibility as someone who can not only inform collectors about what's going on, but also serve as a vessel to tell the story of coins in ways that the broader numismatic community can't?
That's an interesting way of framing the role of a storyteller, right? And the role of a communicator is that in so many ways, I'm not writing just for myself, and I'm writing to represent a community. And not germane to numismatics specifically, but I started to have the sort of first dim awakenings of that sense that you're talking about when I was in college, and I began writing for the college newspaper my first week of my freshman year, and I kept on working right until basically a couple weeks before I graduated. And I became the largest responsibility I had in that role was editor. And so, inevitably when you're reporting on campus happenings, and college campuses are fairly political places, and political being defined just as having to do with politics, and I'm not referring to any one specific agenda, because I think that's a way that people commonly talk about the academy. But, I would have people come up to me and tell me, hey, I think you're right on, or hey, I think you're full of it. And, it doesn't register at first that, you're writing to an audience, and that audience is going to respond to the work that you do. And moreover, that audience is going to feel represented or not represented by certain coverage. So not only is accuracy important and taking great pains to research out every fact you reference and to, try to make sure that you're getting the most accurate and current information, but there's also an extent to which you're writing against or with people's sensibilities. You're either going with or against the grain of the sensibilities of any given community. And, I certainly, in things that I've written, many of which I would defend on their factual merits, and I would defend on the basis of whatever editorial comment, to the extent I made an editorial comment where appropriate, that people sharply disagreed with. And, it can be a little bit scary being on the receiving end of someone's, of someone's strong disagreement. Though I think that the way that I found best to deal with that concern is just to ensure that what you're writing is accurate, and that, whatever interpretation of historical items you're putting forward is plausible and is based on sort of a verifiable, exterior reality, I guess is how I would put it. And to say, and to make sure that, your comments are measured in the sense that you don't want to make claims that go beyond not only the factual merits of what you're talking about, but to ensure that, your comments remain within in the realm of reason. And so to write for the coin community, I've found tremendously rewarding. And though occasionally there have been contentious moments, as there are, but I would argue that that almost any writer, if your writing is completely acceptable to everybody, and if you're pleasing everybody, that writing isn't necessarily bad writing. It might be great writing, and it might be valuable research. But I do think that there's a value in trying to challenge particularly cultural norms within the industry. So I think that striking a balance between those things, between those two poles of good research, but also, being willing to explore difficult topics, or being willing to sort of offer an alternative perspective. Having to balance those interests has been one of the most challenging but rewarding aspects of this work.
How daunting is it for you, or how difficult do you think it is to maintain an interest or develop an interest in areas of numismatics that, from a collecting standpoint, are far beyond our means as publishers and journalists? Many of the major coins that we're expected to report on, celebrate, and write feature articles about can cost as much as cars and houses, well beyond the means of most people. How do you come to terms with that?
I had spent, even just as a Coin World reader, before I got involved with producing content for them, I'd been salivating over coins that cost hundreds of thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'd been salivating over coins like that for a long time, because you read a lot of these stories about this really spectacular material, whether it's in amazing condition, whether it's a beautiful design, whether it's incredibly rare. You read about these things, and learning about them is fascinating. You can, absorb a lot of interesting lessons about economic and social history from these objects. You can appreciate that collectors who tend to buy those kind of things or collectors who can afford to buy those things are often highly specialized and have a very, very deep understanding of the series that they're collecting. And you can sort of appreciate that interest and that sort of, I hesitate to use the term passion just because it feels a little overused, but, and you can step back and appreciate that, but simultaneously, as a reader, as a consumer of numismatic media, I often felt slightly alienated by that, to the extent that it is a little bit hard to read about someone paying luxury car amounts of money for a coin that I'll probably never be able to afford. And even when I first approached Coin World and when I first started working there, I articulated that perspective. I essentially said, as wonderful as it is to read about, a Morgan dollar or a large cent that sells for, $15,000 or something, I think that to a lot of collectors, particularly, solidly middle class collectors, to the extent that there are a lot of those people left, I could see how reading about that day in and day out gives the impression that, numismatics is an industry that is only for the well-off or the well-capitalized. And I think it's obviously not, but I think it's incumbent on people who are in the industry, both at the very highest levels, conducting these massive auctions, and also just on people like us who write about it, all the way down through all the different sort of strata and experience levels of numismatists. I think it's vitally important to be ambassadors for the hobby and to demonstrate that, you don't have to be in the 1%, so to speak, to participate and for your collection to be meaningful, right? Because I think that when we put something in print, or in your case, in print on the internet, we're more than tacitly giving it meaning, in the sense that since CoinWeek or CoinWorld is writing about it, that demonstrates that it's something that is important, or at least it's important enough that a well-established hobby publication felt, the need or the interest to comment on it. So I think that it's incumbent on people who produce numismatic media and, some of the auction houses and other organizations that are responsible for selling it. I think it's incumbent on all of those groups to try to talk about material at all different price points, and to try to, and to try to celebrate collections that might not be, these blockbuster, name brand, well pedigreed collections, but that all collections have some value and that they represent a sort of intellectual pursuit and just a personal passion, and that everyone's, irrespective of what your interest is, your collection and your participation in the hobby is important.
Do you ever find yourself intimidated as a collector of more budget-oriented material when going to a major coin show? Even as a professional, is it still intimidating to go to the table of somebody that is selling higher-end material and engage with them? I joke around with my colleagues and say that coin dealers who wear $3,000 suits aren't selling $200 coins. Has that ever crossed your mind? Have you ever had a difficult experience with a dealer based on your cost awareness and what their niche was?
I absolutely have. I think that almost everyone in the numismatic industry has experienced that at some point in time. I think everyone has not only, put their foot in their mouths or, had a contentious interaction with a dealer, but I think, like me, I imagine a lot of people feel a little bit nervous approaching a case that contains hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of amazing high-end material. And I think that there's also an important lesson about sort of the optics of the hobby embedded in these experiences, to the extent that I've had a number of interactions with dealers where I've essentially been told that, well, why would I deal with you? You're here to spend $200. There's someone over there that's here to spend $200,000. Or $2 million in really extreme cases, though I've had fewer interactions with people who are at that level, but you understand what I mean. And not only I find that attitude condescending and dismissive, but it also doesn't make for a very good sales pitch for the hobby. I mean, some dealers are often very friendly to to kids or to younger people who show up and are, very cordial, irrespective of how much money that person has to lay down. But at the same time, I do think that there's an attitude of, well, I'm here at this coin show for 4 days. I need to make X amount of money. I need to pay off my booth and make, this is a large chunk of my living for the year. So you can understand that people are very conscious of how they're spending their time if they have to make a certain amount of money in a certain time frame. That said, there's something to be said for trying to cultivate future customers in the sense of, if an inexperienced collector goes to a show, unwittingly talks to a high-end dealer, the high-end dealer realizes that this person's wasting their time. If that high-end dealer promptly tells them to screw, so to speak, that collector could be alienated and stop collecting altogether. Or, only collect lower-end material. Or, there could be any number of, I think, very reasonable reactions to that experience. And so I think that it's, again, important for not only numismatic journalists and dealers, but everyone who operates in the numismatic industry to make respect have the same value and cachet as the coins that we all collect. And to recognize that just because someone doesn't have the money to sort of indulge their interest or indulge their hobby, to the extent that makes sense for a dealer's bottom line, that, basically, if a dealer has to brush someone off who they know isn't going to spend a lot of money or they perceive to be, quote unquote, wasting their time, don't put it to the collector like that. Be cordial, be polite is what I would hope would be the reaction of most people. But I can understand there's definitely a factor of intimidation when approaching really high-end material, and I have absolutely felt that.
It's funny. In the beginning, it was very much on my mind, but I've also been very fortunate. One thing that I found is, some dealers or professionals in the hobby have notorious reputations for being difficult. But I can count on one hand the negative interactions that I've had. And like I said, I've been very fortunate. I've gone head-to-head on some contentious topics with some of the strongest-willed and most outspoken people in the industry. And I've held my own, but I've done so completely respecting the position that the person had. And when we were wrong as a media organization, we faced the music. At the same time, I found that maybe my experiences have been blessed by the fact that I've got established as a position of authority at CoinWeek early on in my career. So some of the hard knocks that I had to experience were alleviated by staying up to 2 and 3 in the morning studying my ass off to catch up with all the things I needed to know. But one thing that I very much appreciate that I've seen in recent years is that some of the biggest established companies have come to understand the scalability issue and take consignments of coins that aren't as expensive or exclusive. On the other hand, I think one of the biggest growth areas in the hobby going forward is going to be coins that are priced under a couple $100s. And we see over at CoinWeek the level of interest and enthusiasm for stories, articles, and videos about 20th century or modern coins. And I think that the established industry would do well to learn this lesson before it has to learn the lesson. I think the 20th century and modern coins are going to be the cornerstones of the hobby for the next 50 or 100 years. And that means that those coins have upside potential that may not be apparent to us now. And I think it's going to be harder for the industry to rely on 19th century material, which, was the backbone of American numismatics for a long time. So, I don't know. To me, the ability to see stats in our articles and our videos, our podcasts, has given me a level of insight into what's going on with the mainstream of the hobby that I don't know would be as easily discerned if I had to rely on, print journalism subscription numbers.
Yeah, I would be tempted to agree that, having that sort of raw data immediately at your fingertips definitely, provides insight, at least into what, people who are going to seek out numismatic media are interested in. As far as the potential areas for potential expansion within the industry, I think I agree with you that 20th century, mid to lower end, at least of the price spectrum, 20th century material, I think because of its accessibility, and I can't help but think that the World War I and World War II era material, the 35% silver alloy war nickels, the steel cents from World War II, I can't help but feel like that material, just because not only does it have a story that connects to an event that looms large in the American imagination, but also because you can acquire that stuff fairly inexpensively, and there's an interesting story that references economic and social history. Again, to tie that back, I could see that material being very popular. I do think that numismatic media in general, and coin dealers and major auction houses specifically, would do well to try to think about I guess I would call it the sort of wow factor of certain coins, in the sense that if you show someone let's say, a rare Liberty-seated dollar, for collectors or for someone who is intimately familiar with Liberty-seated coinage, with sort of the economic history of the 19th century, that would be tremendously interesting. And for people who know the rare dates or who know about the series, there's sort of an organic interest there. But compare that against, let's just to pick a price point, a $50, Roman silver coin, right? And there are Roman silver coins that can be had for around that price point. Someone might go, wow, this was spent 2,000 years ago or 1,800 years ago, or however old, obviously it depends on how old the coin is. And I think that there's a little bit more, there's that wow factor of this is an item that has lasted X many years. I feel like whenever I speak to people, or in a lot of cases, when I speak to people who don't know very much about coins but have maybe come into a collection, there is an erroneous, if somewhat understandable, perception that older material automatically correlates to higher value. And of course, anyone who knows anything about numismatics understands that not only does that correlation not really exist, but there's not really any reason for that correlation to exist, in the sense that it's how rare the coin is, not when it was struck. Though when it was struck can be tremendously interesting. A common 1,800-year-old coin is not nearly as valuable as a 1913 Liberty Head nickel, because there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of accessible Roman coins, but there are only 5 1913 Liberty Head nickels. So trying to educate the sort of public at large about the relationship between age and price, but also trying to demonstrate that there are fascinating historical pieces that can go back millennia that are accessible on a relatively small budget, I think that that's going to lead to an uptick in interest, to the extent that people might not even know that they could own an 1,800-year-old coin at a price point that they can afford. So having sort of numismatic headlines that focus, I don't want to say unduly, because auction coverage, particularly high-end auction coverage, is very important, and it's valuable to the hobby. I can't help but think that focusing, editorial comment and editorial focus on more accessible coins, at least a little bit more than might historically have been devoted to that material, I think that would be a direction where, in terms of reaching out to the public at large to try to, get new collectors or to try to get a broader base of people interested in numismatics, that might be an avenue worth exploring.
One of the first things people ask for, and we get these calls all the time, is, I've got this coin, what's it worth? I had a call probably 2 days ago where somebody called and they had a 1942 Mercury dime and they wanted to know how much it's worth. They were like very breathless, that they had found this rare thing. And I said, well, the value of the coin is based on the spot price of silver and what the condition of the coin is. And I said, now when it comes to condition, it's very difficult to explain this over the phone to somebody who's not experienced. And I don't know what you have, but does it look like it's a brand new dime? Like it just got made? If it looks like a brand new dime, it's certainly going to be worth more money. But if it doesn't look like that, if it looks like it's been around the block a few times, but you can still see the details and everything on the coin, it's probably just worth the price of silver, maybe a little bit more. And she goes, what's that mean? And I said, well, your dime might be worth $2 or $3. That's it? That's all it's worth? And I'm like, well, it is, in this circumstance, 20 or 30 times its face value. That's pretty valuable for a beat up old dime. So some people, they hope that every time they find something new or unusual and change, maybe they've struck it rich. But the 20th century overall has a number of fascinating opportunities for collectors. And even if you find that beat up Mercury dime, it's still cool. Look at like what you could collect from the 20th century. You got the Franklin half dollar, Eisenhower dollar. You got the Mercury dime. Well, you have the Washington quarter, before it becomes a token coinage during the state quarter program. You have wheat cents, on and on and on it goes. And I think there are a lot of cool things in clad, brass, and silver, and, of course, fantastic gold coinage. Hell, even when it comes to the commemorative coins, not much of a fan, to be honest, of the modern proof commemorative series, but I do like the uncirculated versions of the modern coins. Many of the designs are great, not all of them. And then when you go back to the classic period, I think almost all of them are great, if not a little bit overpriced in the current market, but definitely beautiful. 20th century is where it's at.
I completely agree with you on the commemoratives. That's an area of numismatics that I learned quite a bit about in my time at Coin World, and I think can make for really not only interesting collectibles, but can make for really great coverage, because some of them have really interesting stories, and they're the motifs that appear and the sort of historical episodes that are illustrated on their services. Some of them are actually very, very interesting. And you have the Alabama Centennial half dollar, the first coin designed by a woman, and it has 3 dates, 1819, 1919, and 1921. And so I completely agree with you there. But you referenced something that I think it's something that worries me a little bit, and it's where I feel like we as numismatic journalists, dealers as numismatic professionals, and really just collectors who care about the health of the hobby really need to be careful, and that's the disappointment that some people can feel when it turns out their coin isn't very valuable. Because, you mentioned the person who called about a 1942 Mercury dime, which, unless it's the 42/1, or some other rare, overstruck type or something like that, it's not a very valuable coin. Now, I imagine most people would accept the fact that they didn't stumble upon $1 million rarity. I would hope that most people would handle that with grace. But I do think, and this is where we could have an interesting conversation about the role of the quote-unquote mainstream media. I'm hesitant to use that term because it's kind of turned into a political football. But, it seems like every time, a 1943 bronze cent comes up, the very rare, the handful of bronze cents that were struck in 1943 instead of his encoded steel, excuse me, the media kind of breathlessly reports, wow, this penny is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, or this penny is worth $1 million. And it's understandable why they would report on that. It's a curiosity. It's something that most people probably haven't heard of. And the idea of a 1-cent coin, which so many people now perceive to not be worth very much, and in fact, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives actually once referred to in a hearing as litter, the idea that something like that could be so valuable and the sort of tease of, ooh, what if you have one in your pocket? It's understandable why media outlets, especially those that are chasing clicks or chasing exposure, it's understandable why such a story would appeal to them. But it also creates sort of a false sense of numismatic value in other pieces. So then, someone goes onto the Home Shopping Network, they buy a set of, every single uncirculated presidential dollar in a beautiful mahogany case. They go and they buy that material, sometimes with, I think, very pure motives. I think some people really do want to create a family heirloom. They want to create something that's going to be a store of value, something that can be passed from generation to generation. I think a lot of people genuinely want to do that, and I think that that's a very nice and to some extent admirable motivation. Then they buy the stuff, which is, obviously not worth a fraction of what they paid for it. Then, either a couple of years later, if they're trying to get rid of it in the short term, or, years and years later when whoever ends up holding it or whoever ends up possessing it goes to try to sell it, and then they're told, yeah, well, this is incredibly common material. It's only worth a fraction of what you paid for it. I think that there can be sort of a disillusion that sets in where they want it to be valuable. So they'll say, well, screw you. Why are you lowballing me? This set was advertised as being an amazing investment. People want to believe the get-rich-quick scheme over the sort of professional advice. And so I think it's important that dealers deliver bad news in sort of a compassionate way, but also that, and I think a lot of dealers understand this, and I think a lot of dealers, at least in my own experience, are sort of cognizant of this and try to deal really, especially with inexperienced people, they try to deal fairly with them to give them sort of a positive numismatic buying or selling experience. And I think that trying to demonstrate that there is a side of numismatics that's honest and honorable, in the sense that it's not a bunch of people trying to hawk worthless material and try to make a quick buck, but it's a group of professionals that are dedicated to giving people a venue through which to explore their own interest in history or in art or art history or any of the other numerous disciplines that numismatics touches in one way or another. And to try to counteract the narrative of the get-rich-quick scheme with collecting intentionally and sort of soberly, so to speak, and in the sense soberly meant to say not caught up in a whirlwind of excitement about, I'm going to make $1 million by flipping this rare 1964 Kennedy half dollar. To replace that with a more reasoned and more deliberate approach that takes into mind all of the valuable numismatic research that's being done by numismatic journalists, or whether it's people that are just really passionate about a series, and trying to encourage people to explore the hobby in a more considered way.
Well, Google's an amazing tool. I know exactly the kinds of coin promotion and marketing you're talking about. But I think with a good Google search, you can pretty much come up with most of the relevant information you need. I'll give you an example. When I was at the CoinEx show in St. Louis last year, and amazingly at the hotel, their cable system had not one, but two Coin TV shows. And so I sat down watching one of them in my hotel room. And the guy was selling St. Gaudens 1924 double eagles that had supposedly come from a recently found hoard or bag or something. The curious thing about that claim was that they had all been graded at different times. And so some were in old blue holders and some were in modern holders and a couple were in green holders. So, clearly, if they had come from a bag, they weren't all graded together. But I think that claim was rather dubious. And so in that respect, I don't think you really need to say to people that the coins are from a hoard or a bag or anything like that to be interesting. A 1924 St. Gaudens double eagle is an interesting coin in its own right. But, the dealer was promising that if they bought them, they would get them so cheap and that they were able to offer them so cheap and sell them for only 10% over the cost because they bought such volume and such insiders, yada, yada, yada. But if you go to your Google machine and go to your recent eBay auctions completed, you'll see comparable material and you'll see what that kind of material goes for and what I would call a non-professional collector to collector or maybe even a dealer to collector basis. And if you're comfortable with the price tag that's being offered on the TV show, then you can get viable material that way. You could also work with a dealer or go to a coin show in the metropolitan area. Just depends on you, your level of patience, your enthusiasm. what you're looking for. I also think that selling coins in the mainstream, even if it's late night coin TV shows, there's ultimately the possibility of a net benefit for the hobby because not everybody's in the tribe already. Not everybody subscribes to magazines or buys books, comes to websites. But there could be something that gets the attention of somebody and makes them realize that coin collecting is a cool hobby, and that coins are interesting, and that there's a ton of coins out there that they could collect, and many of which they've never seen before or heard of, and that there's a journey they can go on. I'll take it back for me. As a child, I got into coins because my grandmother was into coins, but I remember being in the Boy Scouts, and I would get Boys Life magazine every month in the mail, and in the back of Boys Life magazine there were coin ads. In comic books, there are also coin ads. And I do remember at the time I was trying to buy a bag of wheat cents from a company, and I sent them the money they asked for, and I don't know, it was like $2 or something, and I sent it in change. And a few weeks later, a bag of wheat cents arrived in my mailbox. And inside that bag of wheat cents was a note saying, "Next time you order, please include postage and handling," which I hadn't done. I didn't know. And that company, turns out, it was Littleton. And Littleton primarily sells coins to the general public. And for me, that act of kindness, sending a bag of wheat cents to a kid without me completely paying for the order, something that I held on to. I held on to that memory for 30 years. And I do think that in some respects, companies that sell to the general public and bring people into the hobby, as long as it's being done in an ethical way, and I think a way that is intended to keep people in the hobby, then I think it's a good thing. And national newspapers, they used to have coin columns. They don't anymore. So when it comes to broadcasting the coin story to a national audience, it has to be more than just, here are some super rarities. And like you said, when a 1943 copper coin sells, we are inundated with comments and emails from people who want to know that every penny that they have is one of those. And it's sort of what happens. So I do like seeing regular material discussed so that people can get enthusiastic at the hobby at a level that's realistic.
And to that extent, the availability of information on the internet is a great boon to anyone who is considering getting into coin collecting or who doesn't know quite what to do with a coin collection. And, organizations like Coin World or CoinWeek putting out as much good information as possible to try to guide both the inexperienced and the experienced in the right direction to find the outlet for selling coins that's best for them or the outlet for buying coins that is best for them based on their, like you said, cost parameters and, degree of interest in the hobby and degree of experience. And, there is some conventional wisdom on this that I think is very valuable in the sense that, build relationships with local dealers. If you know that there's a dealer that specializes in the material that you're interested in, build a relationship with that person. And I think that that's one of the lesser appreciated benefits of numismatics is that it plugs you into a community. I feel like there's at least in a lot of sort of mainstream think piece culture, there's a tendency to lament the disintegration of community in the face of social media and in the face of sort of technological and economic shifts that have been occurring over, in some cases, decades, if not longer. And I think that a hobby like coin collecting has not a unique appeal, but an appeal that is becoming less and less common or it's becoming more and more valuable. And that's that communities do exist in this industry. Now, the communities are a lot smaller than they once were. I think that, there's declining membership in national organizations and there's sort of a declining cultural relevance to coin collecting. But coin collecting as a hobby and the institutions associated with it, I think present a unique opportunity for marketing in the sense that if someone who is interested in coin collecting might not have an amazing coin collection and might not have a lot of money, if any money at all, to go out and build a large coin collection or a coin collection that's sort of quote unquote worthy of professional notice, those people can find a community in their local coin club or in a coin club that specializes in their material that might meet at a national show once or twice a year. And people who really plug into those networks and start to interact with people, whether it's in clubs, at coin shows, or in any other sort of social context that is created by coins and coin collecting, I think that can actually break down some of the barriers that exist between not only people of different political ideologies or different backgrounds, but I think it can create a space where people share a passion together and explore it together. And I think that's a great selling point, to say that, this is a space where people can come together and can learn about something, and that they don't necessarily have to pay a ton of money to do it. They don't have to have an amazing collection to be a part of this. They don't have to be a world-renowned expert on a certain class of material for their knowledge to be considered valuable or their perspective important. And I think that trying to create spaces for interaction and discussion and debate, I think that there are valuable debates to be had about, the culture of symbols that we talked about before, where there, even within the numismatic community, there is considerable disagreement. Or the more technical side, someone might have a different idea about how to attribute a particular variety, or might notice, or might think they've identified a new variety, and the sort of the numismatic version of peer review kicks in, and people can weigh in with their thoughts. And again, to that extent, I think that it gives people a space to feel like their voice is heard and their interest is valuable. And that is something that I would love in my own work, and I sincerely hope that my own work has, in whatever small way. I don't fancy that it's had some massive impact, but I would hope that whatever work I end up doing in the numismatic industry, my aspiration is to draw attention to things that might be a little bit more obscure, and is to try to build this community and to try to have interesting conversations within that community. So I guess that's kind of my highest aspiration vis-a-vis my own work in the numismatic industry.
Well, Chris, I appreciate that sentiment, and I'm excited to see how that develops for you over the coming years. We are community professional writers and really proselytizing for the hobby and trying to talk about it in new and innovative ways. Trying in a modern age to keep the story of this analog collectible and the history it represents relevant to people. So I do appreciate you coming on the podcast and taking the time. Seems like you're doing double duty today, huh?
Thank you so much for having me on. Any opportunity to talk about the hobby and to talk about my own work within it, and to hear your perspective, and it's all great. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. If you like this podcast, please share with your friends. Remember, you can download every episode of the CoinWeek Podcast for free from the iTunes Store or stream it online on CoinWeek.com. For CoinWeek, I'm Charles Morgan. Until next time, happy collecting.